Welcome to Greyvale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Sometimes the dead cannot speak plainly. They must guide us through dreams, leading us to the dark places where secrets are buried. Tonight, the ghost of Lord Lovell grants Sir Philip a vision, a journey into the Earth's hidden memory. The chilling encounter in the armory had shattered the foundations of Sir Philip Harclay's world. He was a man of steel and stone, a man whose reality was defined by the solid, tangible things he could see and touch. The reassuring weight of a sword in his hand, the unyielding strength of a castle wall, the firm ground beneath his feet. But in that cold, shadowed chamber, he had been forced to confront a truth that lay beyond the reach of his sword and outside the realm of his experience. He had been touched by a ghost. He had heard a whisper from beyond the grave, and the single damning word the spirit had uttered, betrayer, had transformed his mission from one of suspicious inquiry into one of sacred, vengeful duty. The ghost of his friend, his brother-in-arms, Lord Lovell, had confirmed his darkest fears, and in doing so had laid a heavy, spectral mantle upon his shoulders. He was no longer merely a guardian to a bereaved child. He was now an instrument of justice for the restless dead. He had retreated from the armory like a man fleeing a plague house, his mind a maelstrom of horror and grim resolution. The image of the rattling, blood-stained armor and the memory of that dry, whispering voice were burned into his mind, a permanent, searing brand. He found no solace in the rest of the castle, which now seemed even more sinister and unwelcoming. Every dark corridor seemed to hold a lurking threat. Every gust of wind from the raging storm outside seemed to carry the echo of that terrible, spectral whisper. The very stones of the castle, which he had once seen as symbols of enduring strength and honor, now seemed to be silent, complicit witnesses to a terrible crime, their cold surfaces saturated with the memory of betrayal. He felt the weight of his new purpose as a physical thing, a heavy coat of mail that he could not remove. He had sworn a silent, solemn oath to the tormented spirit in the armory, an oath to uncover the truth, to expose the traitor, and to see justice done, no matter the cost. But how? He had no proof, only a ghost story that any sane man would dismiss as a product of grief and an overactive imagination. The new baron held all the power, and Philip was merely a guest in a castle that was no longer a friend's home, but an enemy's fortress. He eventually made his way back to his assigned chambers, the single candle in his hand a small, fragile beacon against the oppressive, encroaching darkness of the castle. The room, with its grand, tapestried walls and its large, canopied bed, offered no comfort. It felt like a gilded cage, a luxurious prison cell. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a pile of sullen, glowing embers that provided little light and even less warmth against the profound, bone-deep chill that had settled in the rumor perhaps, had settled within him. He did not bother to undress. The weight of his exhaustion was a physical force, a leaden cloak upon his shoulders, and he collapsed onto the bed, his heavy riding boots still on, his mind still racing. Sleep, he knew, would be a long time coming. He lay on his back, staring up at the dark, velvet canopy of the bed, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. The storm still raged outside, the thunder a low, continuous, guttural rumble, the wind a high, mournful cry, a fitting symphony for the turmoil in his own soul. He replayed the events in the armory over and over again in his mind, dissecting every detail, searching for some flaw, some hint that it had been a trick of his own senses. But the memory was too vivid, too real. The clenching of the gauntlet, the violent, death rattle of the steel plates, the impossible, soul-chilling cold, and that voice, that terrible, dusty whisper from the helmet's dark, empty slit. It was real. He knew it with an absolute certainty that defied all reason. And with that certainty came a profound and terrifying question. What now? The spirit had given him an accusation, but no name. It had confirmed a betrayal, but offered no proof. How could he, a living man, hope to unravel a conspiracy that was being guarded by the living and revealed only in cryptic whispers by the dead? He felt a wave of profound helplessness wash over him. The task before him seemed impossible, a fool's errand set for him by a ghost. He was one man against a new and powerful lord, a man who had, he was now certain, committed murder to gain his title. Lying there in the dark, caught between the raging storm without and the raging turmoil within, an immense, soul-deep weariness began to claim him. His adrenaline-fueled state of high alert began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion unlike any he had ever known. His eyelids grew heavy, the weight of them too great to resist. The sharp, clear edges of his thoughts began to soften, to blur, to dissolve into a strange, gray twilight of the mind. He was not falling into a peaceful sleep. It was a surrender, a collapse. He was succumbing to a fitful, troubled, and utterly exhausted slumber. A descent not into rest, but into a different realm of consciousness. A place where the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin and porous. As his consciousness finally slipped its moorings, his last waking thought was of his friend, of Lord Lovell, and a silent, desperate plea for guidance. And in the strange, fluid, and lawless landscape of the dream, his plea was answered. He found himself standing not in his bedchamber, but back in the vast, echoing, and deeply silent armory. The storm outside was gone. The room was no longer lit by his single, wavering candle, but by a strange, diffuse, and sourceless silver light that seemed to emanate from the very air itself, casting no shadows. He was standing once again before the dark, shadowed alcove, his gaze fixed upon the solitary, blood-stained suit of black armor. It stood perfectly still, a silent, brooding monument of steel and sorrow. And as he watched, a change began to occur. A soft, pale, and ethereal light began to glow from within the armor's closed helmet. The light grew in intensity, a cool, silver-white luminescence that poured from the helmet's narrow eye-slit. The light coalesced, and then, with a silent, graceful movement, it flowed outward, separating itself from the steel and taking on a form. It was the ghost of his friend, Lord Lovell. He was not the terrifying, rattling specter of the earlier encounter. Here, in the realm of the dream, he was a shimmering, ethereal figure of pale, silvery light, his form translucent, his features recognizable but softened, as if viewed through a veil of tears. He wore the ghostly image of the very armor from which he had just emerged, but it was whole and unbroken, the terrible, crushing dent in its breastplate gone. His spectral face was a mask of profound, heartbreaking grief, a sorrow so deep it seemed to be the very substance of his being. He did not speak. He simply raised a single, luminous, and transparent hand and beckoned, a clear, silent, and undeniable summons for Philip to follow. The dream was not a product of his own troubled mind. Philip understood with a sudden, intuitive clarity. This was a message, a visitation, and he had no choice but to obey. He was an apprentice to a ghost, and his first lesson was about to begin. In the strange, silent, and shadowless landscape of the dream, Sir Philip Harclay found his will subsumed entirely by that of his spectral guide. The shimmering, ethereal figure of his murdered friend, Lord Lovell, floated before him, a being of pure, sorrowful light, its form a stable, luminous beacon in the unreal, silver-lit armory. The ghost's gesture, the single, raised, translucent hand beckoning him forward, was not a request, but a command that resonated in the very core of Philip's dream self. He felt no fear of the apparition now, only a profound, aching pity and a resolute, unquestioning sense of duty. He was here to learn, to witness, to understand. He gave a single, solemn nod of assent, a gesture that seemed to satisfy the silent spirit, and began to follow. The ghost of Lord Lovell did not walk. It glided, floating a few inches above the cold, stone floor, its movement as smooth and as silent as drifting smoke. It led him away from the alcove of the blood-stained armor, down the central aisle of the armory, past the silent, steel-clad effigies of its own noble ancestors. As they passed, Philip had the unsettling impression that the empty helmets of the other suits of armor turned, just slightly, their dark, empty eye-slits following the progress of their ghostly descendant with a silent, collective, and sorrowful reverence. The ghost led him not towards the great oak door through which he had entered, but towards the solid, unadorned stone wall at the far end of the long chamber. Philip's dream mind felt a flicker of confusion. This was a dead end. There was no door, no passage. But his spectral guide did not slow, did not hesitate. With a smooth, uninterrupted grace, the luminous figure glided forward and passed directly through the massive, solid stone wall, its form dissolving into the stone for a moment like a drop of milk in dark water, before reappearing, whole and undiminished, on the other side. The ghost paused, turning its sorrowful, luminous face back towards Philip, and beckoned again, a clear and undeniable command for him to do the same. Philip's own dream self, now untethered from the familiar, rigid laws of the physical world, obeyed without question. He walked towards the cold, hard wall, a surface he knew in his waking mind to be several feet thick, a part of the castle's very foundation. He braced himself for the solid, jarring impact, but it never came. As he reached the wall, his own form, his own perception of self, seemed to lose its solidity. The cold, hard stone dissolved before him, becoming a strange, gray, swirling mist. He felt a moment of intense, disorienting cold, a sensation like plunging into the heart of a winter fog, and a strange, grinding pressure, as if he were moving through the very substance of the earth itself. Then, just as quickly, he was through. He emerged from the other side of the wall, finding himself whole and unharmed, standing beside his ghostly guide in a place he had never known existed. They were now in a narrow, natural passage, a rough-hewn tunnel that was clearly not the work of man. The air here was immediately and profoundly different. It was cold, not with the supernatural chill of the ghost's presence, but with the deep, damp, and eternal cold of the deep earth. It was heavy and thick, and it smelled of wet soil, of dripping minerals, and of ancient, undisturbed stone, the clean, primal scent of a place that had never known the sun. The passage was tight, its walls composed of rough, jagged rock that glistened with a thin, slimy film of moisture in the ethereal light that emanated from the ghost itself. The tunnel sloped steadily downward, leading them deeper and deeper into the very foundations of the castle, into the secret, subterranean world that lay beneath the man-made structure. This was a place of nature, a secret artery in the body of the earth that the castle's builders had either not known about, or had deliberately walled away. As they journeyed deeper into the earth, a new and unsettling sound began to manifest, a sound that seemed to emanate not from any single source, but from the very rock that surrounded them. It was a faint, almost inaudible whispering. It was not a single voice, but a chorus of faint, disembodied murmurs, the ghostly echoes of sounds that had been absorbed by the stone over centuries. At first, they were indistinct, a meaningless, sibilant hissing, like the wind blowing through a keyhole. But as Philip focused his dream senses, he began to be able to pick out individual, fragmented sounds from the cacophony. He heard the faint, ghostly echo of two men arguing in low, angry tones, their words unintelligible, but their emotions rage and fear perfectly preserved. He heard the heartbreaking, spectral sound of a woman's quiet, desperate weeping, a sound that seemed to soak the very walls with sorrow. And then, a single, sharp, and terrifying sound cut through the murmuring chaos, a sound that was so clear and so filled with agony that it made Philip's dream self flinch. It was the ghostly, echoing cry of a man shouting a single, desperate word. No! The cry was filled with a sense of ultimate betrayal, the sound of a man realizing, in his final, terrible moment, that his trust had been fatally misplaced. The cry echoed for a moment in the narrow passage and then faded, leaving behind a silence that was even more profound and more chilling than the whispers had been. The stones themselves were a library of past agonies, and they were telling him the story of the castle's great, hidden sin. The ghost of Lord Lovell seemed oblivious to, or perhaps was the very source of, these terrible, echoing sounds. It continued to glide steadily downward, its luminous form a solitary beacon in the oppressive, suffocating darkness. The only other sound in the passage was a slow, steady, and horribly hypnotic dripping. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of water, falling from a great height and landing with a soft, echoing splash somewhere in the darkness ahead. The sound grew steadily louder, more resonant. As they proceeded, each soft impact a slow, relentless, and liquid counting of the seconds, a sound that seemed to be measuring out the long, lonely, and eternal passage of time in this dark, forgotten place. The sound was both mundane and deeply terrifying, the patient, indifferent heartbeat of the underworld they were now entering. The narrow, claustrophobic passage finally began to widen, the rough, stone walls pulling back, and they emerged into a larger, open space. They had arrived at the source of the dripping, at the end of their subterranean journey. They were standing in a small, roughly circular, natural grotto, a secret cavern hidden deep beneath the castle. The chamber was dark and alive with a damp, glistening sheen. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone and a strange, almost metallic scent, like a freshly struck flint. The ceiling was a high, dark dome, from which hung a forest of sharp, pointed stalactites. They looked like long, white, wicked-looking teeth in the jaw of some immense, slumbering subterranean beast. Or, Philip thought with a shiver, like 1,000 daggers of pure ice, forever threatening to fall. Water constantly and silently wept from the porous stone of the cavern walls, running in thin, glistening rivulets down to the floor. And it was from the sharp, needle-like tips of the stalactites that the relentless dripping sound came. Hundreds of tiny, clear droplets formed and fell in a slow, random, and yet collectively constant rhythm, a soft and sorrowful rain that had been falling in this chamber, unseen and unheard by human ears, for thousands of years. Each drop landed with a soft, musical splash into a perfectly still, perfectly black pool of water that occupied the center of the grotto. The pool was a perfect circle of absolute blackness, its surface as smooth and as reflective as a dark mirror, its depths impossible to guess. With each falling drop, a series of tiny, perfect, and silver ripples would spread silently outward from the point of impact, disturb the perfect surface for a moment, and then vanish, leaving the pool as still and as black as before. The cavern was a place of immense, patient, and eternal sorrow. It was a place of weeping stones and silent, black tears. The ghost of Lord Lovell, his spectral guide, glided to the very center of the chamber, coming to a halt directly above the dark, still pool. Its luminous form cast a pale, shimmering, and ghostly reflection on the water's black surface. It turned its translucent, light-filled body to face Philip one last time. Its spectral face, which had been a mask of profound grief, now seemed to be filled with an even deeper, more heartbreaking emotion. A sense of finality, of a duty performed. It had brought him here. It had shown him the place. Its role as a guide was now over. The ghost raised its hand, not in a summons this time, but in a slow, sad gesture of farewell. And then, it began to fade. The pale, silver light of its form began to dim, to lose its coherence, its edges dissolving like smoke in the wind. The familiar, sorrowful features of his friend melted away, the luminous body becoming a mere cloud of faint, sparkling motes of light. And then, with a final, gentle sigh that was more a feeling than a sound, it vanished completely, its light dissolving into the oppressive, absolute darkness of the grotto. The moment the ghost disappeared, Philip was plunged into a total, disorienting blackness. But the absence of the ghost's light was the least of the changes. As the last mode of spectral light winked out of existence, an intense, bone-chilling cold, a cold far more profound and more terrible than the natural dampness of the cave, flooded the grotto. It was a psychic cold, the cold of utter abandonment, of absolute despair, of a soul left utterly alone in an eternal, hopeless darkness. It was the ghost's own personal hell, and Philip was now standing in the very center of it. The darkness was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on him from all sides, and the cold was a sharp, piercing blade that seemed to be aimed at the very center of his soul. He was alone, in the dark, in a secret place deep beneath the earth, a place of terrible, weeping sorrow. And he knew, with a final, dawning horror, that the vision was not over. The guide was gone, but the message, the true, terrible heart of the dream, was about to be revealed. The narrow, claustrophobic passage, with its whispering walls and oppressive, earthy darkness, finally began to change. The rough, jagged rock that had pressed in so closely on either side started to recede, the ceiling rising into a high, unseen vault. The oppressive, confining feeling of the tunnel lessened, replaced by a new and different kind of awe, a sense of entering a space that was both vast and intimately sacred. Sir Philip Harclay's dream self, following his silent, luminous guide, stepped out of the passage and into a place of profound, ancient, and heartbreaking beauty. They had arrived at the source of the relentless, dripping water, the end point of their strange, subterranean pilgrimage. They were standing in a grotto, a secret, natural cavern hidden deep within the earth, a place that felt as though it had been sealed away from the world since the dawn of time. The chamber was roughly circular, a near-perfect bubble in the rock, perhaps 40 feet in diameter. The air here was cool and clean, washed by the constant presence of water, and it carried a sharp, mineral scent, the clean, elemental smell of wet, living stone. The ethereal, silvery light that emanated from the ghost of Lord Lovell filled the space, not with a harsh brightness, but with a soft, diffuse, and gentle luminescence, revealing a scene of breathtaking and sorrowful splendor. The walls and the high, domed ceiling were not smooth, but were covered in a dense, crystalline forest of stalactites and stalagmites. They had formed over uncounted millennia, the slow, patient work of dripping, mineral-rich water. The stalactites hung from the ceiling like 1,000 gleaming, translucent daggers of ice or a vast, frozen chandelier carved by some elemental artist. The stalagmites rose from the floor to meet them, some thin and sharp as needles, others thick and massive as the pillars of a forgotten temple. The entire cavern glistened and shimmered in the ghost's pale light, every surface coated in a thin, perpetual film of moisture, making the grotto look as though it had been carved from a single, gigantic, weeping jewel. It was a place of impossible natural architecture, a secret cathedral built by the earth itself. But there was no sense of peace here. Despite the breathtaking beauty, the grotto was saturated with an atmosphere of profound and overwhelming sorrow. It was a beautiful place that had been consecrated to grief. The source of this feeling was the water. It was everywhere. It wept silently from the porous stone of the walls, running in thin, glistening rivulets that looked like permanent, silver tears tracing paths down the dark rock. And it was from the sharp, crystalline tips of the countless stalactites that the relentless, echoing dripping sound came. Hundreds upon hundreds of tiny, perfectly clear droplets formed and fell in a slow, random, yet collectively constant rhythm, a soft and melancholy rain that had been falling in this chamber, unseen and unheard by human ears, for thousands of years. It was the sound of the earth's own quiet, eternal weeping. Each perfect, gleaming drop fell with a soft, musical, and strangely resonant splash into a perfectly still, perfectly black pool of water that occupied the exact center of the grotto. The pool was a flawless circle, about 20 feet across, its edges formed by a natural, smooth rim of rock. The water within it was as black as a starless midnight sky, and so unnaturally still that its surface was a perfect, dark mirror, flawlessly reflecting the weeping, crystalline ceiling and the pale, shimmering form of the ghost. It was impossible to guess its depth. To look into it was like staring into a polished obsidian gateway to an infinite, silent abyss. The constant, rhythmic dripping of the water was the only sound in the grotto, a slow, patient, and hypnotic beat that seemed to be the very heartbeat of the cavern's sorrow. It was a sound that measured not time, but eternity, each drop another moment in a never-ending vigil of grief. This was a place where sorrow had become a physical element, as real and as tangible as the stone and the water. The ghost of Lord Lovell, his role as a guide nearing its end, glided forward, moving from the edge of the grotto to its very center. It moved with a silent, weightless grace, floating out over the surface of the black, still pool. It did not disturb the water. Its luminous, translucent form passed over the glassy surface without causing a single ripple, its own pale, shimmering reflection the only evidence of its passage. The ghost came to a halt directly above the absolute center of the pool, hovering there like a lost star that had fallen to earth. And there, it turned, its form rotating slowly to face Philip one last time. The ethereal light that composed the spirit seemed to brighten for a moment, and Philip could see his friend's spectral face with a new and heartbreaking clarity. The features, softened by the dreamlike reality, were a perfect mask of profound, inexpressible grief. The translucent eyes were fixed upon him, and in their sorrowful silver depths, Philip saw not just a plea for justice, but a deep, weary, and terrible loneliness. It was the look of a soul that had been trapped in its own personal hell for a very long time, a hell of darkness and cold, and the ceaseless, weeping memory of its own betrayal. This, Philip understood, was the ghost's true sanctum, its most secret and sorrowful haunt. This was the place its spirit returned to when it was not rattling its own steel shell in the armory. This grotto was the core of its pain. Having brought Philip here, having shown him this most sacred and terrible of places, the spirit's purpose was now fulfilled. It had passed on the knowledge, the location, the very essence of its sorrow. The ghost raised a single luminous hand, not in a summons this time, but in a slow, sad, and final gesture of farewell. And then, with an almost imperceptible sigh that was more a feeling than a sound, it began to fade. The process was slow, a gentle and graceful dissolution. The pale, silver light of its form began to dim, to lose its coherence. The familiar, sorrowful features of his friend began to blur, the solid-seeming form becoming a mere cloud of faint, sparkling, ethereal motes of light, like dust motes dancing in a moonbeam. The light swirled for a moment, a final, silent vortex of sorrowful energy, and then, it winked out of existence, its light completely absorbed by the oppressive, absolute darkness of the grotto. The moment the ghost vanished, the world changed. Philip was plunged into a total, disorienting, and suffocating blackness. The absence of the ghost's gentle, silvery light was a physical blow, a sudden and shocking sensory deprivation that left him feeling utterly blind and helpless. But the loss of the light was the least of the changes. As the last mode of spectral energy dissolved, an intense, bone-chilling cold, a cold far more profound and more terrible than the natural dampness of the cave, flooded the grotto. It was a psychic cold, an active and malevolent chill that seemed to emanate from the dark, weeping stones and the black, silent water. It was the cold of utter abandonment, of absolute despair, the cold of a soul left utterly and eternally alone in the darkness. It was the ghost's own personal hell, and now that the ghost itself was gone, only its raw, undiluted essence remained. The cold was a sharp, piercing blade that seemed to be aimed at the very center of his soul, and the darkness was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on him from all sides, stealing the very air from his lungs. He was alone. He was alone in the dark, in a secret place deep beneath the earth, a place of terrible, weeping sorrow. The only sound was the relentless, eternal, and now horribly menacing drip, drip, drip of the water, each soft splash a reminder of his own terrifying isolation. He wanted to scream, but his throat was locked with a fear so profound it was beyond sound. He wanted to run, but in the absolute disorienting blackness, he had no idea which way to turn, no idea where the exit tunnel was. He was trapped. He was trapped in the heart of a dead man's sorrow, and he knew, with a final, dawning horror, that the vision was not yet over. The guide was gone, its duty done, but the message, the true, terrible, and tangible heart of the dream, The very reason he had been brought to this dreadful weeping place was about to be revealed. He stared, his eyes wide and useless in the total darkness, at the spot where the ghost had vanished, at the black, silent, and waiting surface of the central pool. The absolute, suffocating blackness of the grotto was a living thing. It pressed in on Sir Philip Harclay's dream self, a tangible weight that seemed to constrict his chest and steal the air from his lungs. The vanishing of his spectral guide had not brought an end to the vision, but had instead plunged him into its true, terrifying heart. The gentle, sorrowful presence of the ghost was gone, replaced by the raw, undiluted essence of its eternal torment. A profound, bone-shattering cold and a darkness so complete it was a form of sensory annihilation. He was utterly blind, adrift in a sea of non-being, with the slow, relentless, and now maddeningly hypnotic drip, drip, drip of the weeping stalactites as his only anchor to a reality that was rapidly dissolving into pure nightmare. He stood frozen, not by choice, but by a paralysis of sheer, overwhelming terror, his dream eyes staring, wide and useless, at the spot where the ghost of Lord Lovell had so gracefully dissolved, the dead center of the black, silent, and waiting pool. He did not know how long he stood there in that state of suspended horror. In the timeless, lawless geography of the dream, it could have been a second or a century. But then a change began. In the absolute, featureless blackness of the central pool, a faint, almost imperceptible point of light was born. It was not a reflection. There was no light to reflect. This was a light generated from within the abyssal depths of the water itself, a pinprick of nascent, otherworldly luminescence in the suffocating dark. It was a pale, cold, and ghostly blue-white, the color of a distant star seen through a telescope, or the phosphorescent glow of deep-sea creatures that live their entire lives in a world without sun. The light was faint at first, a tiny, fragile spark, but it was enough to give Philip's terrified eyes a single point of focus in the overwhelming void. The light did not remain a mere spark. It began to grow, to expand, to intensify, pulsing with a slow, steady, and deliberate rhythm, like a great, cold, and spectral heart beginning to beat in the watery abyss. The pale, blue-white glow spread outward, a silent, blooming flower of cold fire, illuminating the black water from within. It cast a ghostly, upward-facing light, turning the weeping stalactites on the cavern's ceiling into a forest of stark, white, skeletal fangs, and throwing vast, dancing, and monstrous shadows against the glistening, wet walls of the grotto. The light was not warm or welcoming. It was a cold, clinical, and deeply unnatural light, the light of the morgue, the light of the grave, and it seemed to make the profound chill of the cavern even more intense, if such a thing were possible. And from the center of this burgeoning, spectral light, an object began to rise. It did not float to the surface. It did not burst forth with a great splash. It rose with a slow, smooth, and utterly impossible majesty, emerging from the depths of the pool as if being lifted by an unseen, steady hand. It ascended without disturbing the glassy, black surface of the water, without causing a single, solitary ripple. The water seemed to part before it, to peel back with a silent, reverent respect, allowing the object to pass from its dark, liquid realm into the cold, damp air of the grotto. The object rose point first, a sharp, gleaming tip of pale, light-infused steel breaking the surface, followed by the long, straight, and terrible length of a blade. It was a sword. The ghostly weapon continued its slow, silent, and inexorable ascent until it was fully revealed, hanging suspended in the air directly above the center of the pool, at the very spot where the ghost of Lord Lovell had vanished. It hung there, perfectly vertical, its point aimed at the black water below, its pommel aimed at the weeping cavern ceiling above. It was a magnificent and terrible sight, a vision of both beauty and profound desecration. It was a long sword, a weapon of war, its design both elegant and brutally functional. The hilt was long, designed for a two-handed grip, and it was wrapped in what looked like dark, braided leather, a practical grip for a fighting man. The crossguard was a simple, unadorned bar of dark, blackened steel, and the pommel was a heavy, spherical counterweight. But it was the blade that held Philip's horrified attention. It was a long, broad, double-edged blade, forged from a steel that now seemed to be composed of pure, solid, blue-white light. The entire sword was radiating the strange, unholy glow, a beacon of supernatural energy in the darkness. But the blade was not clean. Its ethereal, luminous beauty was horribly, unforgivably marred. It was streaked and smeared with a dark, ugly, and obscenely visible stain. The stain was concentrated near the hilt, and it ran in long, dark, dried rivulets down the length of the glowing blade. It was the unmistakable stain of old, dried blood. In the ghostly, blue-white light of the sword itself, the blood stain did not appear red or brown, but a deep, sick, and absolute black, a patch of pure, light-devouring void against the luminescence of the steel. The fact that the stain was still visible, that it had not been washed away by the water of the pool from which it had just risen, was a testament to its supernatural permanence. This was a blood stain that could never be cleansed, a stain not just on the metal, but on the very soul of the weapon itself. This was not just a weapon, it was a piece of evidence. It was the murder weapon. The spectral sword hung suspended in the air above the black, still pool, a silent, terrible, and accusatory vision. It did not move, but it was far from inert. It radiated an aura of immense, multifaceted power. It pulsed with the same intense, bone-deep cold that had flooded the grotto upon the ghost's disappearance. A cold that spoke of death, of the grave, of a life violently and unjustly extinguished. And it emitted a sound. It was not a loud or aggressive sound, but a low, faint, and continuous humming. A sound that seemed to be the very voice of the vibrating, glowing steel. It was a sound that was both a low, mournful lament, a song of sorrow for the noble life it had been forced to take, and a low, angry growl of accusation, a simmering, centuries-old rage at the treacherous hand that had wielded it. The hum was a complex chord of grief and fury, and it resonated deep within Philip's dream self, a sound that he felt in his bones and in his soul. He stared at the terrible, beautiful, and damning vision, his mind finally grasping the full, horrifying scope of the ghost's message. The encounter in the armory had been the accusation, the confirmation of a betrayal. This dream, this journey into the weeping heart of the earth, was the revelation of the proof. The ghost had led him here, to this secret, hidden place, to show him this, to show him the instrument of its own demise. The dream was a map. The grotto was a real place, a place hidden somewhere deep beneath the foundations of Lovell Castle. And in that real place, submerged in a dark, silent pool of water, was the sword, the very sword that had been used to murder his friend. A sword still bearing the indelible, ghostly stain of his friend's noble blood. The image of the glowing, humming, blood-stained sword, hanging suspended in the absolute darkness of the weeping grotto, burned itself into his mind with the force of a branding iron. It was a vision of such terrible, chilling clarity that he knew he would never be able to forget it, not for as long as he lived. It was the final piece of the ghostly puzzle, the final, terrible clue. The ghost had shown him everything it could. The rest, the discovery of the real grotto, the recovery of the spectral sword, the unmasking of the betrayer, was now up to him. The sword hung there for one final, eternal moment, its accusatory hum reaching a new, higher pitch, its cold, blue-white light flaring with a final, brilliant intensity. And then, the vision, having delivered its terrible, silent testimony, was violently and abruptly torn away from him. The vision held him in its icy, hypnotic grip. The glowing, blood-stained sword, hanging like a malevolent star in the absolute, weeping darkness of the grotto, was the single, terrible focal point of his entire existence. The low, sorrowful, and accusatory hum it emitted was the only sound in the universe, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly with the marrow of his bones. He was a prisoner of the dream, a helpless observer held fast by the sheer, overwhelming power of the ghostly revelation. The image of the spectral weapon, a thing of both terrible beauty and profound desecration, burned itself into his mind, etching every terrible detail into his memory with the permanence of a master engraver. He saw the intricate, dark wrapping of the hilt, the simple, brutal honesty of the crossguard, the pale, cold, and unholy light of the blade, and most vividly of all, the obscene, dark, and eternally wet-looking stain of his friend's murdered blood. This was the ghost's final, terrible gift. A clue, a map, and a sacred, undeniable burden. He had been shown the truth, and now the weight of that truth was his alone to carry. The sword hung there, suspended in the black, timeless void of the grotto, for a moment that stretched into an eternity. Its low, vibrating hum seemed to intensify, to build towards some unknown, unbearable crescendo. The pale, blue-white light that radiated from it flared with a final, brilliant, and almost violent intensity, as if the spirit's last, desperate burst of energy was channeled into this one, final, unforgettable image. And then, the dream, its terrible purpose fulfilled, did not gently fade. It was not a slow, soft return to consciousness. It was a violent, brutal, and instantaneous wrenching. One moment, he was in the cold, dark, and dripping heart of the earth, his soul filled with the humming, spectral sorrow of the ghostly sword. The next, he was violently, agonizingly torn away. The sensation was not like waking up. It was like being physically seized by an immense, invisible hand and hurled across a vast, chaotic distance. A feeling of rapid, tumbling, and disorienting travel through a void. The image of the sword shattered. The humming was cut off. The darkness was replaced by a blinding, chaotic flash of pure, white, mental static. He awoke with a gasp, a raw, ragged, desperate sound that was half a sob and half a scream. He did not gently stir or slowly open his eyes. He was thrown back into his own body with the force of a physical blow, his consciousness slamming back into his flesh with a sickening, jarring impact. He found himself sitting bolt upright in the large, canopied bed in his chambers, his body rigid, his hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. His heart was a wild, panic drum, hammering against his ribs with a frantic, painful rhythm, as if trying to beat its way out of his chest. His lungs burned, and he gasped for air, his breaths coming in short, shallow, and ragged bursts, the air of the room feeling thin and useless after the heavy, damp atmosphere of the grotto. A cold, clammy sweat drenched his body, soaking his clothes and plastering his hair to his forehead. Yet he shivered with a deep, violent, and uncontrollable ague, his teeth chattering in his jaw. He was back. He was in his room. He was awake. But the dream was not gone. The vision had been shattered, but its ghost remained. A vivid, searing afterimage burned onto the backs of his eyelids. Even with his eyes wide open, staring into the dim, familiar gloom of his bedchamber, he could still see it. The image of the glowing, blood-stained sword, hanging in the absolute darkness of the weeping grotto, was superimposed over his vision of reality, a translucent, ghostly presence that refused to fade. He could still hear the faint, echoing remnants of its low, accusatory hum, a faint, high-pitched ringing in his ears, and most terribly he could still feel the cold. The natural chill of the stone-walled room and the dying embers in the hearth were nothing compared to the profound, bone-deep, and utterly unnatural cold that he had brought back with him from the dream world. It was a cold that clung to him, a psychic residue of the grotto's eternal sorrow. The very air in the bedchamber felt heavy, damp, and charged with the same, lonely despair he had felt in that subterranean cavern. The dream had followed him back. It had stained the fabric of his reality, its ghostly presence a terrifying confirmation that what he had experienced was not a mere nightmare, not a simple product of a troubled mind and a heavy supper. It was a visitation. It was a message. And it was real. He sat there for a long time, his body trembling, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of horror, grief, and a new, cold, and diamond-hard resolve. The storm outside had finally begun to exhaust itself. The furious, howling wind had softened to a low, mournful sigh, and the relentless, drumming rain had lessened to a soft, pattering whisper. A faint, pale, gray light, the first, tentative herald of a bleak and sorrowful dawn, was beginning to seep through the edges of the heavy curtains, diluting the absolute darkness of the room. But the dawn brought no comfort, no sense of hope or renewal. It only served to illuminate the stark, cold reality of his situation. The helplessness he had felt before the dream was gone, burned away by the cold, blue-white fire of the spectral sword. In its place was a terrible, unwavering certainty. The ghost of his friend had not just shown him a vision. It had given him a map. It had given him a purpose. The grotto was real. He knew it with an instinct that was now as certain as his own name. It was a real, physical place, hidden somewhere deep beneath the castle, a place that held the key to the entire mystery. And in that grotto, waiting for him, was the murder weapon, the one single piece of irrefutable proof that could expose the traitor and bring the new Baron's reign of lies crashing down around him. The dream was a sacred charge, a holy quest laid upon him by the tormented spirit of his dearest friend. He was no longer just a man seeking justice. He was the chosen champion of the dead, the sole executor of a ghostly will. The path forward was no longer shrouded in doubt. It was now terrifyingly, dangerously clear. He had to find that grotto. He had to retrieve that sword. He had to confront the betrayer, not just with suspicions, but with the very instrument of his crime, a blade that still bore the spectral, indelible stain of his victim's blood. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his gut, but it was now overlaid with something stronger, something harder. A cold, righteous, and utterly implacable fury. The game had changed. He was no longer just a guest in Lovell Castle. He was a hunter, and he would not rest until he had unearthed the castle's darkest secret, no matter the cost. A dream, or a message from the grave. Sir Philip has been shown a hidden place, and a hidden weapon. What terrible truth does the blood-stained sword represent? And is the grotto a real place, hidden deep beneath Lovell Castle? Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.